Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Minority Rule, the right-wing attack on the will of the people and the fight to resist it, by Ari Berman. Narrated by Tiedemann. The supreme issue, involving all the others, is the encroachment of the powerful few upon the rights of the many. Robert Fighting Bob La Follette, 1913. Prologue. Fear of a White Minority. In May 1995, Republican presidential candidate Pat Buchanan appeared at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. to announce a new immigration policy as the centerpiece of his campaign. It was the start of Immigration Awareness Week in the United States, but Buchanan was not in a welcoming mood. "If the present trends hold," he said, "white Americans will be a minority by 2050. Instead of reaching out to Latinos and other minority groups and embracing the country's changing demographics, Buchanan warned, "We have an illegal invasion of this country." He called for building a Buchanan fence, patrolled by the U.S. military along the U.S.-Mexico border to keep out undocumented immigrants, hiring 5,000 new border agents, instituting a 5-year moratorium on legal immigration, and changing the 14th Amendment to deny citizenship to children born in the United States to undocumented parents. Buchanan wanted to make America first again, borrowing a phrase from his former boss Ronald Reagan's campaign slogan, "Let's make America great again." He was surrounded on the podium by the leaders of 6 groups devoted to restricting immigration, such as the California Coalition for Immigration Reform and Floridians for Immigration Control. He held a copy of a new book called Alien Nation, Common Sense About America's Immigration Disaster by the conservative journalist Peter Brimelow, which proposed harsh limits on non-European immigration. A lengthy excerpt of Brimelow's book, titled Time to Rethink Immigration, had run as a 16-page cover story in the conservative magazine National Review, accompanied by an image of Lady Liberty with her hand raised as a stop sign. "America will become a freak among the world's nations because of the unprecedented demographic mutation it is inflicting on itself," Brimelow wrote. He called for cutting legal immigration by 2/3 and repealing the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, which had overturned a 1924 law passed by Congress that instituted strict quotas on immigration from everywhere but Northwest Europe. It was adopted in a nativist fervor after migration from Southern and Eastern Europe had skyrocketed in the late 1880s and early 1900s, making the country more urban than rural for the first time and diluting the power of Anglo-Saxon whites. The 1990 census, which coincided with Buchanan's first presidential bid in 1992, was the first to predict that whites would one day become a minority in the country. New projections show that the number of minorities, bolstered by heavy immigration and high birth rates, is growing much more rapidly than the number of white Americans, the Scripps Howard News Service reported. Buchanan realized before any other major politician that white anxiety about their impending minority status could be a powerful issue, especially for Republicans, and he styled himself as a leader of a new restrictionism movement that advocated for the toughest limits on immigration since the 1920s. "The question we Americans need to address, before it is answered for all of us, is, does this first world nation wish to become a third world country?" he wrote in 1991. Buchanan himself came from a family of immigrants. His mother's family was German Catholic and his father's Irish Catholic, the type of people who once faced discrimination from Anglo-Saxon Protestants. But race, not country of origin, was the dividing line in the Georgetown neighborhood of Washington, D.C., where Buchanan grew up as one of 9 children. The Washington of his childhood in the 1950s was a sleepy and segregated southern city, he wrote. The Negroes of Washington had their public schools, restaurants, bars, movie houses, playgrounds, and churches. and we had ours. His parents were fierce anti-communists, and Buchanan's boyhood idols were Senator Joe McCarthy and Spanish dictator General Francisco Franco. The family took a dim view of the left-leaning civil rights movement. After graduating from Columbia Journalism School, Buchanan became an editorial writer for the conservative St. Louis Globe-Democrat in 1962, writing columns denouncing the local NAACP as communist-infiltrated. In St. Louis, he met Richard Nixon, who would capitalize on domestic unrest and a white backlash against the civil rights movement. Buchanan became a speechwriter for Nixon and attended the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. He stayed in a 19th-floor suite at the Hilton, overlooking Grant Park. One day, while hobnobbing with the likes of Norman Mailer, he watched as the police beat thousands of unarmed anti-war demonstrators. Much of the country recoiled from the violence, but Buchanan saw an opportunity. He wrote to Nixon and urged him to visit Chicago and stand with the great silent majority against the demonstrators. The term silent majority became a memorable shorthand to describe aggrieved white Americans. In the 1960s, a new commitment to equality had replaced the old age of explicit white supremacy, marked by a dramatic and sudden expansion of democratic rights. In a remarkable 15-month span from July 1964 to October 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Immigration and Nationality Act, a sweeping trio of anti-discrimination laws that would transform the politics and demographics of the country. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 desegregated nearly every aspect of American life, from schools to public accommodations to workplaces, and expanded the promise of the 14th Amendment by ending discrimination based on race, sex, and gender. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 struck down the literacy tests and poll taxes and other suppressive devices that had rigidly maintained Jim Crow in the South for nearly a century. It enforced the long-ignored provisions of the 15th Amendment and enfranchised millions of voters of color. The Immigration and Nationality Act, also passed in 1965, opened the doors of the country to the developing world in the first significant way and embraced the language of the civil rights movement, specifying that no person would be discriminated against in the issuance of an immigrant visa because of his race, sex, nationality, place of birth, or place of residence. It was, in many ways, a second Reconstruction, extending long-delayed rights of citizenship not just to African Americans, but many other previously disenfranchised and marginalized communities. This put America on the path to becoming an enduring multiracial democracy for the first time in the country's history. But Buchanan knew that the second Reconstruction of the 1960s would spark a backlash like the first one had in the 1860s, and he understood better than most how to mobilize white voters who viewed the extension of new rights to African Americans and other minorities as threatening their power. Buchanan helped steer Nixon, who had supported the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, away from the civil rights movement. He urged Nixon not to visit Martin Luther King's widow, Coretta, on the first anniversary of his assassination. Initially, the visit would get excellent press, Buchanan wrote in a 1969 memo, but it would outrage many, many people who believed Dr. King was a fraud and a demagogue, and perhaps worse. Buchanan counseled Nixon to ignore liberal issues like housing, education, and unemployment. The second era of Reconstruction is over, he wrote to the president in 1970. The ship of immigration is going down. 20 years later, when Buchanan launched his first presidential campaign, he took this white backlash strategy directly to the South. While campaigning in Georgia, he visited Stone Mountain outside of Atlanta to admire the giant carvings of the Confederate generals Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis in the hillside, which he called a beautiful monument. He denounced the civil rights laws of the 1960s, labeling the Voting Rights Act an act of regional discrimination against the South, and endorsing its repeal. When he traveled to Mississippi a week later, he laid flowers on the grave of a slaveholding Confederate ancestor who was captured by General William Tecumseh Sherman during the Civil War. Another relative, he said proudly, had died in action as a Confederate soldier. They both tried to overthrow the government of the United States, he said. They didn't. This time, we're going to settle accounts for our ancestors in dealing with the Yankees in Washington, D.C. Just as Nixon fended off Alabama's Dixiecrat governor George Wallace, Buchanan was now wooing supporters of David Duke, the KKK leader turned Louisiana state representative, who had launched his own long-shot presidential bid on a platform of white supremacy. The way to deal with Mr. Duke is the way the GOP dealt with the far more formidable challenge of George Wallace, Buchanan said. Take a hard look at Duke's portfolio of winning issues and expropriate those not in conflict with GOP principles. Duke, for his part, said, I think Pat Buchanan sounds more like me every day. Buchanan was the first major presidential candidate to mix antipathy toward the civil rights era with hostility to non-white immigration, making opposition to demographic change the centerpiece of his 1992 and 1996 presidential campaigns. With the white majority he'd built for Nixon well on its way to becoming a minority, this was the next major front in the nation's political and cultural wars. Who speaks for the Euro-Americans, he asked. Is it not time to take America back? Buchanan mounted a strong challenge to incumbent President George H.W. Bush in the 1992 New Hampshire primary, winning more than a third of the vote against a sitting president and framing the race as the Buchanan Brigade versus King George's Army. Buchanan didn't win a single state that year, but he captured nearly 3 million votes, enough to receive a coveted keynote speech at the GOP convention in Houston. He electrified Republican delegates by speaking apocalyptically about a cultural war for the soul of America, denouncing unrestricted abortion on demand, the homosexual rights movement, and radical feminism. The liberal columnist Molly Ivins famously remarked that Buchanan's speech probably sounded better in the original German. Republicans adopted some of Buchanan's positions on immigration as the official party platform, pledging to equip the Border Patrol with the tools, technologies, and structures necessary to secure the border. Buchanan's sister and campaign manager, Bay Buchanan, said structures meant walls. They don't build lighthouses on the border, she quipped. 4 years later, Buchanan won the New Hampshire primary during his second presidential run. He called his followers the true sons and daughters of the Founding Fathers. He portrayed his crusade to preserve Judeo-Christian values and maintain white power in the face of a massive demographic shift, not as an aberration in U.S. history, but as part of its oldest struggle. He ridiculed the media's intoxication with democracy and stated that equal justice for the emerging white minority was more important than extending new rights to formerly marginalized communities. The Founding Fathers did not believe in democracy, he wrote. They did not believe in diversity. They did not believe in equality. Buchanan was dismissed by many as a fringe figure in the 1990s, and he never came close to winning his party's nomination. But his dire warnings about the disappearance of the country's white majority have become a central organizing principle for the conservative movement today. His nativism, racism, and skepticism toward democracy foreshadowed the ideology that now defines the Republican Party. The country is roughly 20 years away from the majority-minority future of Buchanan's nightmares, and new multiracial coalitions are gaining influence in formerly white strongholds like Georgia. To entrench and hold on to power, A shrinking conservative white minority is relentlessly exploiting the undemocratic features of America's political institutions, while doubling down on a wide variety of anti-democratic tactics, such as voter suppression, election subversion, dark money, legislative power grabs, immigration restrictions, census manipulation, and the whitewashing of history. This reactionary movement, which is drastically overrepresented in the Electoral College, the Congress, and gerrymandered legislative districts because of a political system that diminishes the voices of urban areas, young Americans, and voters of color, has retreated behind a fortress to stop what it views as the coming siege. Conservatives like Buchanan have long pointed to the notion that the United States was never intended to be a true democracy, to justify a deep hostility to broad-based political participation. "We're not a democracy," the Utah Republican Senator Mike Lee tweeted on October 7, 2020, defining it as a rule by majority, the view that it is the prerogative of government to reflexively carry out the will of the majority of its citizens. 3 months later, a mob that explicitly presented themselves as heirs to the American Revolution stormed the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, to overthrow the will of a majority of voters. But this crisis didn't begin or end with Donald Trump's attempt to overturn the 2020 election. America's democratic experiment has long been defined by a central tension over whether the government should benefit the many or the few. The United States has historically been a laboratory for both oligarchy and genuine democracy. That dualism is part of its DNA. At the heart of this debate are contested ideas about legitimacy, freedom, and who counts as an American. To grasp the stakes of the present-day fight over democracy, one has to understand the clash between competing notions of majority rule and minority rights that date back to the country's birth. It's certainly true that the founders, despite the lofty ideals in the Declaration of Independence, designed the U.S. Constitution in part to check popular majorities and protect the interests of a propertied, white upper class. The Senate was created to represent the country's elite and restrain the more democratic House of Representatives, while the Electoral College prevented the direct election of the president and enhanced the power of slave states through the 3/5 Clause. Voting rights were restricted in most states to white male property owners, so that only 6% of Americans were eligible to vote in the first presidential election. But as the United States has democratized in the centuries since, extending the franchise and many other rights to formerly disenfranchised communities, the anti-democratic features that were built into the Constitution have metastasized to a degree the Founding Fathers could have never anticipated, threatening the survival of representative government in America. If the Founders once feared what James Madison called the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority, today the central threat facing American democracy is the tyranny of the minority. For the first time in U.S. history, 5 of 6 conservative justices on the Supreme Court have been appointed by Republican presidents who initially lost the popular vote and confirmed by senators representing a minority of Americans. The signature project of those justices has been to nullify the civil rights-era laws that Buchanan railed against. The extreme direction of the court is emblematic of how the counter-majoritarian distortions in American politics have intensified in recent years. Before the 2000 election between George W. Bush and Al Gore, only 3 times in U.S. history had the loser of the popular vote won the Electoral College. But that's happened twice in 16 years since then. It almost occurred a third time in 2020, when Joe Biden won the popular vote by 7 million, but Trump lost the 3 closest states in the Electoral College by just 45,000 total votes. Trump never could have attempted to overturn the results, and there would have been no insurrection if the United States had a system in which every vote mattered equally in presidential elections. Similarly, the level of inequality in the Senate right now, by far the worst among any advanced democracy, would have shocked the likes of Madison. When the founders reluctantly decided to give each state the same number of senators regardless of population, the 1790 census showed that the country's most populous state, Virginia, had 12 times as many people as its least populous, Delaware. Today, California has 68 times the population of Wyoming. 15 small states with 38 million people combined routinely elect 30 GOP senators. California, with 40 million residents, is represented by 2 Democrats. This imbalance is getting worse. By 2040, roughly 70% of Americans will live in 15 states with 30 senators, while the other 30%, who are whiter, older, and more rural than the country as a whole, will elect 70 senators. The structure of the Senate only magnifies the body's unrepresentativeness. Due to the filibuster, which is not in the Constitution, 41 Republican senators representing just 21% of the population have been able to block bills supported by huge majorities of Americans on issues like gun control, abortion, and voting rights. This is not just a problem at the federal level. For much of the past decade, more than 50 million Americans have lived in states like Wisconsin, where Republicans controlled the state legislature despite receiving fewer votes and pioneered new ways to curb political participation. A record number of candidates in key state and local races in the 2022 midterm election sought to override one of the most fundamental principles of a democracy, accepting the outcome of a free and fair election. The reactionary conservatives behind the drive for minority rule claim to be the only legitimate heirs of representative government, but they're seeking to delegitimize and warp the institutions created by the founders. They claim to be appealing to freedom, but they're trying to limit freedom for historically marginalized groups that were written out of the country's original governing institutions. They claim to be the only true Americans, but they're trying to sharply narrow the definition of citizenship and who is entitled to exercise those rights. The struggle throughout U.S. history between constricting and expanding democracy has reached a fever pitch today. A minority of Americans are hell-bent on nullifying the will of the people, but there is also a vibrant and growing resistance to these regressive efforts. The question of whether the United States will live up to Abraham Lincoln's ideal of a government of the people, by the people, for the people, is the defining fight of our time. Chapter 1. Laboratory for Oligarchy. In the late spring and early summer of 2011, soon after tens of thousands of progressive activists had demonstrated at the Wisconsin State Capitol in Madison to protest Governor Scott Walker's bill stripping public sector unions of collective bargaining rights, Republican members of the legislature walked across the street to the shiny glass office of Michael Best and Friedrich, the party's go-to law firm. The GOP was in control of the state's redistricting process for the first time since the 1950s, and Republicans were shown to the map room, where their aides were drawing new political districts in secret following the 2010 census. The legislators signed confidentiality agreements, pledging not to discuss the work with anyone, even though the redistricting process was financed with taxpayer funds and maps had traditionally been drawn at the Capitol, not at a private law firm. Public comments on this map may be different than what you hear in this room, read the talking points distributed to GOP legislators. Ignore the public comments. The new maps had titles like aggressive to describe how they favored Republicans. "The maps we pass will determine who's here 10 years from now," a legislative aide told the Republican caucus. "We have an opportunity to draw these maps that Republicans haven't had in decades." On July 11, 2011, the maps were introduced in the legislature. No Democrat had seen them before they were released. There was one public hearing 2 days later, and the reshaped districts were approved the next week on a party-line vote. Publicly, Republicans downplayed the significance of the maps. "This looks fair to me," said the GOP state senator Van Wanggaard. "I don't have anything jumping out at me." But state politics had been transformed virtually overnight. Nowhere was this more evident than in Wanggaard's hometown of Racine, 100 miles east of Madison. Wanggaard, a former cop with blonde hair resembling Dennis the Menace, lived on a quiet, tree-lined street in a neighborhood known as the Danish Village for its Scandinavian ancestry and numerous bakeries. His 2-story white house had a large American flag hanging from the porch and a pro-police "We Back the Badge" sign in the yard. 2 houses to the south, his state Senate district, the 21st, abruptly cut off to exclude the rest of the largely Democratic neighborhood near Lake Michigan. It used to be one of the state's most competitive Senate districts, encompassing all of rectangular-shaped Racine County, a 50-50 mix of urban and rural communities in southeast Wisconsin. But the new redistricting maps converted the swing district into one that favored a Republican by 16 points. It was now shaped like a horseshoe, pulling in the Republican countryside of Racine and Kenosha counties while excluding heavily Democratic urban areas, except for the block where Wanggaard lived. "It's a prime example of how a party in power chose a district for their guy," said John Lehman, a Democrat who represented the 21st before Wanggaard. Lehman, a longtime public school teacher whose grandfather came to Racine in 1929 to work in a foundry, represented the district from 1996 to 2010. He lived 5 blocks from Wanggaard and used to teach at the same high school where Wanggaard was sometimes stationed as an off-duty cop. Wanggaard defeated him in 2010 by 3,000 votes, but Lehman beat Wanggaard in a recall election in 2012 after Wanggaard voted for Walker's highly contentious anti-union legislation. "I voted for every conservative item that the governor brought forward," Wanggaard told Wisconsin Public Radio. Wanggaard had once been the rep for his police union, and his vote to strip public sector unions of collective bargaining rights infuriated his constituents. Racine's police union endorsed Lehman, who won by 819 votes. By then, the new district lines had been drawn by Republicans, but they didn't take effect until after the recall, which put Lehman in the awkward position of winning an election in his competitive old district, but serving in the new, deeply Republican one. He used to represent all of Racine, a city of 75,000 with a large black population, but his district now stretched to the resort town of Twin Lakes on the Illinois border. In between were old farms, new McMansions, and small towns with yard signs that said, "Keeping Christ in Christmas." Lehman was 6'5", with a bushy gray mustache. Everyone knew him in Racine, but when he spoke at a Memorial Day parade in Twin Lakes, throwing candy to kids, "Nobody knew who I was," he said. When he scheduled listening sessions in the district's rural areas, nobody showed up. "I tried to serve the district, but it was like a foreign land," he said. The new boundaries effectively nullified the recall election Wanggaard had lost and all the unpopular votes he'd cast in favor of Walker's arch-conservative agenda. It was unwinnable for a Democrat, Lehman said. Wanggaard ran again in 2014 and won by 23 points. Most of the state legislature's Republican majority was just as secure. In 2012, Obama carried Wisconsin by 7 points, and Democratic legislative candidates received 51.4% of the statewide vote. but Republicans retained 60% of seats in the Assembly. Under the Republican map,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?